gains, continuing our trip through this beautiful book, The Brain Maker. How are you doing today, Stacey?
I'm doing good, Moselle. How is everybody? I hope everyone's doing good today. This chapter 6 is just really great. As the other chapters have been that Dr. David Perlmutter has presented to us. This book again was written in 2015. So when he talks about studies in this book, he's also talking about studies, of course, a little bit before 215, but he has a whole series of books and he continues his studies and he continues showcasing studies. And again, he has a website for us to follow. When Moselle and I had talked about this book, we had first talked about another book called Brain Grain. So you'll hear me make some references to that book in these chapters that I'm going to discuss with you today. Chapter 6 was Punched in a Gut, and it's the truth about fructose and gluten. And so the beginning of this chapter, he really shares with us a good outlook, which is when we're born, we're given 2 stacks of cards. And he says that we can either have everything favored for us or stacked, without our best favor. And so he says, depending on how you came into this world and what your early life consisted of, that's how you could be put into that category. He says, but then we also put into a position where we can make our own decisions at this point as to which way what road we can go down. And he's saying that it's not too late. Wherever you are right now, wherever your journey has been in the past, wherever you want to go, you have the decision right now to make that decision, which is to be on a healthier path. And so he gives us some guidance as to how we can get there. And he also shares a lot of studies as he has in the past chapters. And he says that, one of the things that he wants to share is changing the state of your gut and fate is just as important as your brain. And so he says it starts with our diet. And he says that, that this is not and so I want to say that this is not a diet that we just get on for several days or for a few months. It's a way of life. So when people ask you, what kind of diet are you on? You say, no, this is just the way we eat. This is my lifestyle. So I'm not on any diet. And so that's one good way that that he points out to us is that, recognizing that that's the journey that we're on. And he says that this diet, that we're on, or lifestyle, the way we eat is very powerful. And it's powerful because it can change our health and the course of any disease that we may come into in our life. And so with that being said, he says that not only is he saying this, he says that there's rigorous science behind all of this. And so he tries to give us a glimpse of that. And he also says that, some of these studies, and he's come across from conferences and then of course some of his colleagues. And then what's really interesting is he's telling us the stuff that has happened in his office. Patients have come to him with different diseases and disorders and just symptoms that they're going through, and he's had people come in and he's seen these people go through this, and that's what he says is truly remarkable when you read this and you hear from him. And so what he says is he says that our way of eating and everything is very complex. He says that it's the diet, it's our gut, it's our microbes and health. And he offers that that's an equation that's really worth looking into. He says overall dietary changes can explain for 57% of our total structural variation of our gut microbiota, where changes in our genetics account for no more than 12%. So that's really, really interesting that, what's there, what comes to us when we're born. And he goes back to, bring up again that, when we come through our mother's womb, we come through with all the bacteria and the good and the bad bacteria that we need to thrive. And when we don't come that way and we come an alternate way, which is through C-section, we don't get those things that necessarily are good for us. I mean, that are what he considers and what science considers really good for us to have to ward off disease and illnesses that may not seem visible in the beginning, but down the road, you will see those. And so that is why we have a lot of other diseases that come in our life. And so he goes on to say that findings indicate that diet has dominated the role of shaping our gut and changing key populations that may transform healthy gut microbiota into a disease-inducing entity. And he repeats that, and he says that if there's one fact that you take away from this whole discussion today, he says, is that and that statement. So you may want to go back and pick up in that chapter 6, that statement. And so he also talks about, there's this one colleague from Harvard, Dr. Fasano, that was one of the leading authorities on gut and brain connection. And he shares the same sentiment of this doctor that we're reading about in his book. And he says, he repeats about how important it is about the method of birth and antibiotics. And so then he goes on to share that he wants to focus on 2 ingredients that are worth us avoiding when it comes to preserving our health, our balance, and function of our belly bugs. And he says the first one is fructose, and the second we'll talk about is gluten. And he says that fructose is one of the most common sources of calories in our Western diet. And he says, as you may already know, it comes naturally from fruit. And he says that fructose mainly comes for us in our diet as a manufactured source. So he says that, one of the things that we can remember is that back, long time ago in caveman, time, they lived off of fruit, but fruit wasn't really available all times of the year. So their bodies knew how to control the sugar that they were intaking, and they didn't have to deal with an abundance of sugar. But now, because we have manufactured, sugars and fructose, our bodies don't know what to do with all of this. And, and so he says that, it's not natural. And so you'll hear me, go through some more of the reasons why. And he gives an example about apple, and how the apple has a lot of fiber in it, and it's, healthy sugar. Whereas, you take a cup of you take a cup of canned soda, and all of that sugar is, not healthy for us, as we all know. And so he's just trying to explain that, fruit has the healthy fiber that we can break down in our bodies. And the soda, we can't. It's foreign to our bodies, and that's the way our bodies react to it. And so then he goes on to talk about that everything, he says that, that let's not forget that, even though fruit is good for us, but at times when we get too much of it, our bodies, may not be able to deal with all of that. And so he's just saying, well, even glucose, which is the unnatural fructose. He's just saying that let's look at how our bodies, function after we get all this in our bodies. It means that we're not able to tolerate it in some instances. We get insulin resistant from it. It causes high food blood fats and hypertension. He says then the liver starts to have issues. The liver is forced to work hard to be able to deal with all this, fructose in our bodies. And then this puts our liver in a position to be left without molecules to complete all of its necessary functions. So once that comes into place, then our liver energy is depleted. And so then that what you'll start to see is what you call uric acid. You may have, heard people say that, my uric acid levels are high. I know here lately, I've started to hear those terms and never really had heard them before. And I thought it was just coming from your meats and everything, but I learned, uric acids come from a lot of the bad foods that we eat, or foods that are not healthy for us. And sometimes it's just, well, we've eaten too much of it. And so then the consequence of it, again, is high blood pressure, gout, and kidney stones. So, and then it also goes on to say that, that a lot of things are labeled high fructose corn syrup. And so if we're not careful, then, and not reading the labels, or if they're not revealed to us, we'll think it's something healthy. So, it just points out to pay attention to those initials, AFCS, pay attention, because it'll even have you thinking that it's coming from fruit, and it really isn't. It's coming from, corn, and it's made, from corn syrup. And so that's not something that we want to have a lot in our bodies. So then he goes on to move on to chapter 4. And well, I'm sorry, let's go back to gluten. So then he says that in chapter 4, we're going to talk, in chapter 4 more about obesity. And he said that that a lot of these, things have led to obesity. And so you remember that when you go back and read chapter 4, and that's what I was trying to point out. And so a lot of this makes sense, but just seeing it, and seeing him discuss it, it reminds you when you're looking at the labels like we're supposed to be looking at when we're looking at any item, especially when we think that it's, it's supposed to be on the healthy aisle or in the section where a brand that normally brings us healthy items, but when you read, you see these things. And so that's why it's important to look up the terms and know what you're consuming. And so then he moves on to the gluten. And he says that gluten really is what he says he saved for last. And it doesn't mean necessarily that it's good. Usually when you say the last, you think about something being good, but he says that gluten is, can be in the forms of protein and wheat, barley, and rye. And those are some of the most inflammatory ingredients in the modern era. He also says that it's very important that the brain, it's very important to know these types of foods that we can consume, because these can definitely cause our brains to be diminished in some form, because of the effects of inflammation. So he says that gluten is like a silent germ. And he says before long, you won't even know it and it'll be too late. So he says, you'll have unexplained headaches, you'll be feeling anxious, wired, tired, all these different symptoms that that can worsen over time. And he says, and what's really interesting is he points out that even a person that goes to the doctor and they get tested, sometimes it can come back negative. And you will think, okay, well, I'm not having any issues with gluten. But it says, but that is the wrong thing to think, because it cannot come up in test, which means down the road you can see what can happen from the gluten, which doesn't necessarily show up in tests. So he's just saying that it could prove to be more dangerous down the road, and that's why he calls it the silent killer. And he says that that's why you have your ADHD, you have more people being diagnosed with MS, ALS, and other neurological symptoms. And so he says, when patients come into his office and they've seen everyone else, the first thing he tells them to do is get rid of all the gluten in their diet. Just simply get rid of it. And so if you've listened to Moselle all this time, she's told us, many times, go in your, refrigerators, go in your cabinets and get rid of all these bad things. So really, all of this goes hand in hand with the direction we've already been given. So you'll see that, it's definitely correlation with what all this whole journey has been about for this program. And so then he finishes up and moves over to chapter 7, and that is bust a gut, common exposures that make our microbiome go bad. And I'm just going to highlight, because it's really clear there, but antibiotics, the pill, NSAIDs, which are Advil and Aleve, he says that I want to stop right there and tell you that with those two, the Advil and Aleve, he says it used to be common that, it was, considered fine to take. He says, back in the 1990s in those studies, and he was like, well, they had studies that said, well, if you took those pills, you could, you could have a 40% reduced risk of getting Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. Well, anyone that hears this will be like, well, great. I've been taking this to help me with whatever ailment I've been going through. But he points out that the other twist of this story is, while you might, not get those two items, but your gut has been destroyed by taking these, by taking these pills. So, that's the new findings from all of this, is that, taking all that medicine has done something else. So that's why they say always learn the symptoms and the side effects when you're taking chemicals, because basically that's what they are, but sometimes they are truly necessary. And so that's what he tells us. If you have to take Advil or Aleve or any of those medicines, it needs to be absolutely necessary, because it does change our gut and the bacteria in our gut. And so then the last thing that I will point out is really about environmental chemicals, which we all know that, you know, because of the environment we're in, we've had to probably introduce a little bit more of that in our homes that we wouldn't necessarily want to. But he says that, you know, there've been hundreds and thousands of chemicals that have been put back, that have been approved in our for our environment to be, you know, put to use. And so what they say is that, you know, they're food from our food additives to pharmaceutical drugs, cosmetics, you name it. They're chemicals that, you know, all around us. But one of the things that that was enlightening to read here is that he says that the BPA, the chemicals in plastic, he says that there are a lot of people that are out there promoting to get rid of that. And so hopefully we should see BPA be taken out of our you know, line of a material to be used, you know, as a chemical material to be used in our products, and that would be great. But then the other side to this is, he says that once that goes away, there's something just waiting to follow in that footstep. So, you know, we get rid of, you know, we look forward to one, you know, bad extremity coming out of our way of life, and then, you know, just get ready for another one. So basically, he just highlights and says that, you know, as much as possible, try to be careful of the creams we put on our bodies, which is everything that we've talked about in this journey so far. And then he just says to stay, you know, get ready for chapter 7. We'll talk, you know, a lot more about the brain maker we have. How do we, you know, keep our brain working well, and how do we, you know, make sure that what we put in our gut keeps our brain healthy. And the other thing that I did not point out on that is GMOs. He says, you know, be aware of the misleading claims for GMOs. GMOs are not natural. So that's, you know, those are animals. Those are how we engineer plants and animals. And he says there's not been a lot of research as of 2015, you know, for this book. He says, but they're doing lots of research to be able to, you know, give a lot of, you know, reasoning behind the fact that that's not good for us. But be aware and stay tuned for part 3, which is the brain maker rehab.
Amen. Thank you so very much, Stacey. That was excellent. Knowledge is power. And what we need to do is to make sure we stay on top of our learning